Okay, so now, shove the chair out of the way here, we are going to do the lecture for chapter 11, Madrigal and Secular Song in the 16th century, that is the 1500s. Up to this point, chapter 10, we covered sacred music during the 1500s. That, of course, is the Protestant Reformation. We talked about music in Calvinist churches, music in the Church of England, and, of course, music in the newly founded Lutheran churches, and music in the Catholic churches. So now what was going on outside of the church during this period of time? Well, first, we're starting to establish a market for music. The fact that the invention of the printing press in the mid-1400s, now by 1500 they had started to print music on a fairly regular basis, this creates a possibility for a market for music. People wanted music to perform themselves. Remember what I mentioned in class, that until the invention of the phonograph, of recording systems by Edison in the 1800s, to experience music you either had to go see someone else perform it live or perform it yourself. So there was this market for printing music and selling that music to both professional and amateur performers. So what we wind up with here is music printing made a much wider dissemination of music possible. In other words, since you can make a lot more copies a lot more cheaply, your music can now spread all over Europe. This leads eventually to composers who become very, very famous. It also allowed you to sell music as a commodity. Instead of writing music and basically only being able to perform that music yourself locally, enables you to sell this music to people who would want to perform it all over Europe, so make money that way. Finally, it catered to the demands of amateur musicians. As I said, people want to perform music, wanted to be able to sing music and play music at home, so you could write this music, have it printed, sell it as a commodity for these amateur musicians. So, of course, people begin to compose in styles that are going to be attractive to amateur musicians. Amateurs wanted to sing in their own language, so composers are now composing more in the vernacular, but not just the vernacular for their own country. They might write in different languages so they could sell music other places as well. We're going to start in Italy. And the first kind of song we're going to talk about is the Frolla. It's a four-part song, so soprano, alto, tenor, bass, four-voice song. It is strophic, meaning same music for every verse. It is syllabic, meaning typically one note per syllable. It is homophonic, meaning homorhythmic, all four voices singing, changing at the same time, creating chord progressions. The melody is in the soprano. The melodies tend to be, or the harmonies tend to be fairly simple and diatonic, and the rhythmic patterns are marked. That is, that they're fairly clear and straightforward. You can see why this would appeal to amateur musicians. Strophic, so you only have to learn music one time, then the lyrics change. Syllabic, much easier to sing. Homophonic, don't have to learn these complex rhythms and when to come in. Melody in the upper voice, you always know where the melody is. Simple harmonies, simple rhythmic patterns. The texts tended to be the kind of thing that would appeal to amateurs, not necessarily to the wealthy, but satirical text making fun of the wealthy and the powerful. Earthy, texts that are maybe about drinking and dancing and just enjoying life, kind of things that would appeal to the common person. Sometimes the lower parts would be played on an instrument. So the top voice would be sung, and then the second, third, and fourth voices could be sung, or they could be played on a single instrument or a variety of instruments. Gave you a lot of flexibility. The Frolla led to the madrigal, and they're very different forms. They're both secular, and they both developed in Italy, so they were originally performed in Italian. But whereas the Frolla was strophic and homophonic, the madrigal was quite a bit more complex. First, they used text depiction, text expression both things that we talked about when we were talking about music in chapter 9. This idea that the music is going to reflect the meaning of the words and or the emotion of the words. So composers began to experiment with the madrigal. They saw the madrigal as their opportunity to create new ideas. And we see some really interesting stuff happening with the form madrigal throughout this century. We're going to touch on some of that as we go. Eventually, because of the influence of the madrigal, Italy became the leading European center for music. The form, whereas the fratella was strophic, meaning same music for every verse, the madrigal is through composed, meaning new music for every line of poetry. The madrigal, essentially, composers would find a poem that they liked, and they would set it to music. Single stanza, so no repeats and no repeated lines. Text straight through with no repeats. Music straight through with no repetitions of music. This is a form called through composed. Topics, love songs, always popular. And pastoral scenes, things happening in the country. You know, ideas of people out walking through the woods or across the countryside, or a beautiful field, or a summer day, or a rainstorm. Any kind of thing having to do with nature. Composers experimented with different textures. They would frequently mix imitative polyphony with homophonic textures. They might both appear in a madrigal. All of the voices were equally important. Instead of the melody always being in soprano, all voices had an equal role, just like what was happening with the motets of the time. Again, just like the fratella, you could perform all the voices, or all the parts vocally, or you could mix vocal and instrumental performances of different lines at the same time. Very famous painting, Boy with a Lute. Printed in the foreground, we have a book of madrigals, so in this case you would assume that he is singing one line and the other lines are being played on a lute. The madrigal was a very important social vehicle. Initially, madrigals were performed for the singers, so the singers could be entertained. Instead of performing them to entertain other people, you would get together and people would perform them just to have fun on a Friday night. Like people might get together today and play video games. Well, people would get together and sing madrigals, maybe a little more constructive than playing video games. It was mixed groups of women and men, and this is a big deal because in Italy, the Catholic Church is still, of course, in charge, and so women are not allowed to sing music in church. They're not allowed to perform in church, but in secular music and social activities, women and men could mix. As a matter of fact, women were just as involved, were not just as involved, but they were involved in composition and performance of madrigals. Maybe not as much as men were, but certainly they were very, very active. Eventually, by 1570, because of the popularity of madrigals, members of the nobility would hire professional singers to perform at their courts, and they would perform madrigals. So the madrigal really transitioned from being purely for amateur entertainment to being to entertain the nobility. They would hire the professionals. Not to say that amateurs didn't continue to sing them, of course they did. Between 1530 and 1600, over 2,000 books of madrigals were published and printed. Over 2,000 collections. Now some of these collections would contain some of the same madrigals. If a madrigal was particularly popular, then it would be published in multiple collections. But still, just in that 70-year period, over 2,000 printed collections of different madrigals were published. That's how important they were, societally speaking. So, who is one of the first great composers of madrigals? Jacques Arcadelt. Arcadelt was Franco-Flemish, in other words, from that area of northern France and present-day Belgium, what we think of as the Flemish area of northern Europe. However, he lived and worked in Rome until, in Florence and in Rome until 1551, spent a lot of his productive life there, and was very important in the development of the madrigal. On Wednesday, we're going to listen to one of his madrigals, Il Bianco Dolce Signo, which is one of the most famous of the early madrigals. This was published in 1538. The text refers to the Little Death, which was a euphemism for sexual climax in the Renaissance. So the words, dying fills me fully with joy and desire. Definitely secular, not sacred text here. So we will listen to Arkadelt's madrigal on Wednesday. The next of the most important composers, Arkadelt, probably the leading early madrigalist. Cipriano de Rohr was the most important of the mid-Renaissance madrigalists, working primarily in the middle of the 1500s. He, again, was Flemish, just like Arkadelt, but he worked in Italy, again, just like Arkadelt. Now, he is best known today for his madrigals, but he was so well thought of at the time that he actually succeeded Adrien Villard, who we talked about in Chapter 10, as the music director at the Cathedral of St. Mark's in Venice, that amazing cathedral with all the balconies that I mentioned in class, and we'll talk more about St. Mark's in Chapter 12. But being the choir director at St. Mark's in Venice was one of the most important musical positions in all of Italy, and de Rohr succeeded Adrien Villard in that position, eventually giving away to Andrea Gabrielli and Giovanni Gabrielli. There's a very famous portrait of de Rohr. He looks very worried to me. I'm not sure what he's so worried about. Now, something that was happening during this period of time with de Rohr and then leading forward with composers like Marenzio and Gesualdo is chromaticism. Composers began to write highly chromatic music because they felt that chromaticism was an excellent way to express powerful emotions, especially sad emotions. Before the middle of the Renaissance, this kind of direct chromaticism was not allowed. People would not accept you writing chromatic music. The music was quite diatonic. However, this new batch of composers said, well, we can write chromatic music because if you look at Greek music, the ancient Greeks, they used chromaticism. So if they did it, we can do it. Remember, in the Renaissance is this idea of going back to these Greek ideals of intellect and language arts and music. So the madrigalists said, the Greeks did it, so we can do it. It's kind of funny as we go through music history how many times people look back and said, the Greeks did it, so we can do it. They say that a lot. So while chromaticism was forbidden, these new composers said, we're going to use it because the Greeks did it, because we think it's a great way of expressing powerful emotions, especially sad emotions. Now, while most of the poets and composers of madrigals were male, there were a lot of women who were involved as performers and also as composers. Probably the most active of whom was Maddalena Casulana, who lived from approximately 1544 into the 1590s. We don't know exactly when. While most professional opportunities were not available to women, a lot of people were still not going to hire women, although they frequently performed as amateurs. She was the first woman who was considered to be a professional composer. She's the first woman who had madrigals published and sold. However, as I said, women performed madrigals with men on the amateur level, and some of them became professional singers, although they didn't have the professional compositional opportunities. And we will listen, I think on Wednesday, we'll have the opportunity to listen to a piece by Casulana. So, this takes us to the late Italian madrigalists, who to me are among the most interesting of all of the composers. While there were composers from Northern Europe who were writing madrigals during this time, during the late time, the top madrigalists were Italians and were native-born Italians. This is when we get into the late Renaissance now. We've gone past the generation where the Flemish composers have moved to Italy and kind of dominated now native Italians. Now, some of these composers include Luca Marenzio, Marenzio was very well known for the heightened emotions of his madrigals. Now, Marenzio, along with Carlo Gesualdo and Claudio Monteverdi, who we will talk about at the beginning of the Baroque era, Marenzio, Gesualdo, and Monteverdi are known. Now, this is not a term that's in the PowerPoint. I don't think this term is even in the textbook, but it's actually a fairly common term that I want you to know. They were known as the hyper-madrigalists, H-Y-P-E-R, madrigalists, because they used such chromaticism and such dissonance that hyper, well, like hyperspeed means faster than normal speed. The hyper-madrigalists took madrigals further than they had ever been taken before. So Luca Marenzio, Carlo Gesualdo, and Claudio Monteverdi collectively are known as the hyper-madrigalists. Important term. Gesualdo was famous. He was wealthy. He was a member of the aristocracy. Unusual for members of the aristocracy, he composed and published his own music. And he became very well known because he discovered his wife in bed with his wife's lover, and so he murdered them both. Now, being a member of the aristocracy, he did not serve time in prison or was not executed for these murders. He was a man, he was rich, he could get away with that. So he was well known for that particular episode, but he's also well known for his music. He wrote diatonic, but also highly chromatic passages, some intensely dissonant music that then resolves into consonances. He used both homophonic and imitative textures, and used music that moved quite slowly rhythmically, but also then sometimes got quite frantic rhythmically. We're going to listen to and follow along the score to a Gesualdo madrigal that really goes through all of these different extremes of harmony, of melody, of rhythm. He does this because what he liked to do was he would take the poem and he would find certain words that to him were the most expressive words. And so he would, through these musical devices, cause these words to have a great deal of emphasis. Other secular songs that were being written in the days after the Frodla, the canzonetta, well, canzone, song, canzonetta, literally little song, balletto, literally little dance. These were forms that were developed towards the end of the Renaissance just for light entertainment. They didn't have the emotional power, and they were not viewed as being artistic like the madrigal. So, since they were light entertainment, they were homophonic with simple harmonies, simple melodies frequently. Now this balletto, little dance, usually had a dance kind of rhythm, and a lot of times they used refrains with syllables instead of words, like fa-la-la. Deck the Hall of Boughs of Holly uses fa-la-la. That's actually kind of a balletto for a Christmas carol. These genres were very popular in Italy, and they were imitated by German and English composers, as was the madrigal. In France, Clement Jeannequin composed chansons, French songs influenced by the madrigals, and they were quite imaginative. He would actually have the singers imitate bird calls, hunting horns, and sounds of war, dogs barking, when he wrote madrigals that were about hunting and things like that. So it was actually quite creative what Jeannequin was doing with the madrigal in the middle part of the Renaissance in France. Of course, in France, they were called chansons, simply song. Later composers that came from this Franco-Flemish region of Northern Europe, Gombert, Jacob Clemens, Non Papa, and Jan Sweelinck, composers who were mentioned in other chapters, they continued to write chansons in imitative polyphony, in counterpoint, like the older composers did. However, Orlando de Lassus wrote chansons and utilized this new homophonic texture that was coming out of the balletto and the canzonetta in Italy. So some of his songs are homophonic. Some of DeLasso's songs show these influences of the Italian. And his subjects, his poems, he would set everything from very, very serious to very, very PG-13 rated, shall we say. He also wrote motets. He's mentioned in the book in chapter 10. All these composers are mentioned in the book in chapter 10, although I didn't include them in the PowerPoint. But they are in chapter 10 discussing their sacred music, as well as in chapter 11 discussing their secular music. DeLasso was well known for his text setting. He would fit the rhythm of the music so he felt it was appropriate to the text and projected the appropriate feelings of the text. So Orlando DeLasso, a very, very important composer of madrigals and motets during this period. Going on in Germany, we have Meistersingers, which happens to be the name of an opera by Richard Wagner, written during the 1800s. Well, Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg, this Wagner opera, actually centers around a singing competition that happens during the Renaissance. That's why it's called the Meistersinger, because Meistersinger literally translates as master singer. And they carried on the tradition of the mini-singer in Germany, performing solo songs. Now, originally Meistersingers were amateur singers from the cities in Germany who formed singing guilds. In other words, clubs, unions, where they would train and have competitions and things like that. A lot of times they would have competitions, to challenge their members to create new poetry. They'd give them a melody and they would have to write words to it, things like that. So these guilds and the competitions they sponsored actually went a very long way towards creating a lot of the original secular vocal music going on in Germany at the time. So Meistersinger, literally master singer, were carrying on this secular song in Germany during the mid to late Renaissance. Now in England, they're writing madrigals. They were strongly influenced by Italian madrigals. The Italian madrigals have been printed up starting in the 1530s, and they eventually made their way to England and became very, very influential. King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, who are both obviously among the most important members of the nobility, both composed madrigals and other songs as well. As I've mentioned in class, Henry VIII composed music. One of his famous songs, Rose Without a Thorn, is still performed today. So, who was influenced by these madrigals? Well, Thomas Morley was the first of the really important English madrigalists. He also wrote canzonettas and ballettos, although they call them ballets and sometimes canzonas in England, taking off the Italian diminutive. You notice he was born 1557, maybe 1558, lived until 1602. So these madrigals began to be heard in England in the 1560s, right when he was a kid and when he was training. So he lived a fairly short life, just into his 40s, but he wrote some very, very important madrigals, including one we're going to look at quite a bit on Wednesday, My Bonnie Lass She Smileth. This is a balletto. It's strophic, and we actually have in the refrain, fa la la, which is then presented in counterpoint, presented in imitation. So it's really pretty cool. Each section starts homophonically, easy to understand the words, then we go into imitative counterpoint, imitative polyphony for the refrains with the fa la la. Really cool song. We'll listen to it on Wednesday. Morley is also very important as a publisher. One of the most important publications to date from this time. In 1601, Morley published a collection of madrigals called The Triumphs of Oriana. Now, Oriana was one of the nicknames that Queen Elizabeth was known by. And remember, Elizabeth, one of the most important of all English monarchs who has ever lived, incredibly influential. The entire period, the Elizabethan era, is named after her. Oriana was one of the nicknames she was known by. The Triumphs of Oriana was published by Thomas Morley. It is 25 madrigals by 23 different composers. Morley had a couple in there himself. The titles honors Queen Elizabeth, and every madrigal, now this is interesting, he commissioned these so that every madrigal ends with the lines, "Long live fair Oriana," in other words, "Long live Queen Elizabeth." So all 25 madrigals in here end with the same line, the same lyric. Of course, by all these different composers, they're treated differently musically. Probably the most famous madrigal to come out of this collection, out of the Triumphs of Oriana, was "As Vesta was from Lotmos Hill Descending," usually just called "As Vesta was Descending." This is by the composer Thomas Wilkes. Wilkes wrote his own poetry, which worked out really well because he could write words that he knew he would fit well to music. This is why over years many composers have chosen to write their own lyrics as well as the music. Now we're going to look at this madrigal quite in detail because it is probably the best example of word painting or text depiction that's ever been written. It's used as an example in all the music history books, even in all the introduction to music, music appreciation books, because it is such a great example. We're going to look at the melody peaking on the word hill and fast descending scales when they're singing the word descending. It's really quite amazing. Almost every phrase has at least one example of word painting in it. Finally, another kind of secular song that is happening in England during this time are lute songs. Now instead of madrigals and frotlas, which sometimes had one person singing with the other parts being accompanied by an instrument, these are songs that were actually intended with just one melodic line, intended to be accompanied by a lute. Now a lute, you'll notice in the P4O homework, is kind of like a guitar. It's a stringed instrument, but it has a bowl-shaped body to it, so it gives a very unique sound. So it would be a solo song accompanying yourself on the lute. Probably the leading composers, the top composers of lute songs, John Dowland, which is actually pronounced Dewland, I've been told, and Thomas Campion. Notice they lived approximately the same time, both born in the 1560s, both died in the 1620s, and they are very well known for, well, Dewland was known for a lot of different kinds of music, but he's one of the leading lute song composers. And if we have time on Wednesday, we will listen to "Flow My Tears," which was an original lute song that he wrote, which was copied and imitated by a lot of people. It was that popular of a song. This ends the Chapter 11 lecture. We're going to have plenty of time on Wednesday, and I think even Friday I'm going to carry over some of the music study we're going to do. We're going to look quite a bit at English madrigals, Italian madrigals, lute songs, ballettos, and a variety of other kinds of music. Don't forget there is an online quiz that accompanies this lecture. The quiz is due by Friday the 7th at the start of class.